for coming today. I want to start with just a few numbers, and then I'll kind of do an introduction. So there are an estimated 4,300 religions in the world. Now that number probably is a little bit high. Religions do die out, and I don't know that we're in an era where we're actually creating a lot of brand new religions. Some, but not as many as we're losing probably. There are 40,000 Protestant denominations estimated worldwide. That is an incredible number. When we look at just Lutheran denominations in North America, probably 38 or so. Here's a nice list of them. I don't know if you can read those, but and if you go worldwide, there's 145 church bodies in the Lutheran World Federation in 98 countries. So we have all of these options, yet here we are in a Christian church, a Protestant church, a Lutheran church, an ELCA church, and this particular church, which is not the same as other ELCA churches, even just across town. Over the years, I've had a chance to work and volunteer and learn with folks of different religions and people from different brands of Christianity, other Lutheran denominations, and had spent time with people who are kind of in the Lutheran tradition in Europe. And I'm often struck by how many of the things that divide us are really kind of small and trivial. And I ask myself how we allow ourselves to be so tribal. But then you find yourself having a conversation with someone, and you get onto the topic of faith. And you realize that you have these things in common. You're both Christian, team faith, woohoo, you know, this is great. There's that, you know, real bond there for a moment. And as you talk more about your faith, there might be this record scratch moment where everything stops and someone says something that demonstrates their faith, but doesn't in any way represent your faith. And you wonder sometimes if you even read the same Bible or if you worship the same God. I think we live in an era where there's a great sport in highlighting divisions, finding the nearest figurative crowbar and finding that little crack and prying it open to widen those divisions as much as possible. So over the next 5 weeks, I want to talk about those divisions and those differences. My intent isn't to widen divisions. Rather, I think it's just important to ask, who am I? How did I get here? Am I comfortable here? Am I comfortable with myself? If you're like me, you might think about the folks who are worshiping right now down the road, and you know, if you have that kind of self-centered perspective like I tend to do sometimes, you might ask yourself, so why don't those folks down the street just come here and worship with us? Or why don't they do things in their church like we do? So I decided the easiest way to answer some of those questions is to look at all of the history of religion over the last 4,000 years. Now, I realize just how preposterous that task is. So I want to focus on some of those moments where religions or denominations or synods or churches made the decision that the only acceptable course of action was to create a division of some sort, and just look at the differences in general. So I'll get to more of my religious journey in a few weeks when we're kind of talking more about Lutheranism in being specific, but I can say this, St. Andrew I'm a lifelong Lutheran, but St. Andrew is a very different church from the Lutheran church that I grew up with. Praise the Lord. So I want to be clear and say that I'm not an expert in the field. I can tell by looking around, there are people in this room who are definitely more qualified than me to tackle this type of topic. So maybe think of me as someone who was interested in learning and thinking about this stuff, and I went away and did some studying and thinking about it, and I just want to share with you what some of my thoughts are. And if I go off the rails, please correct me. If you have knowledges or experiences, please share them. And hopefully together along the way, we'll learn a little bit more about who we are and how we got here, and maybe, just maybe, we can help us think a little bit about where we're going. So just a couple little things here. Please, if you have any thoughts at any time, let me know right away. This can be real informal. We don't have an enormous number of people, so I find that these types of things tend to be more interesting when people participate. So don't stand on ceremony, just let me know. I am using the microphone. We have a camera back there. This is not live, but we are taping it. So it will be available on the website. If you can't make it and want to catch up, that will be available to you. Usually it takes a couple days and then we'll get it up there. I have an extra mic here. We can pass it around, but it might just be easier, you know, just shout out what you're thinking of, and I'll repeat it into the mic just so we get it on the camera. So, this is just a real simple schedule. I tend to, you know, kind of wander off of what I have planned depending on how people are responding to things, but this is just a general outline. Today I want to talk about the children of Abraham. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a little bit, then kind of move on to the early church and how divisions formed in the pre-Reformation church. Then obviously the ultimate separation was the Reformation, so there's a lot to talk about there. Then looking at how the act of Reformation turned into those 40,000 Protestant denominations. And then a look in more modern times of Lutheranism and how there are so many Lutheran churches in our world, in the United States, and across the world. So any thoughts or questions so far? Good chance for me to take a glass of water.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about Pharisees.
Looking forward to hearing about Pharisees. We will talk a little bit about heresies. Heresies, yes. One person's heresy is another person's doctrine. Yeah, we will definitely get into that. Any other thoughts or questions before I move on? All right. So, Children of Abraham. There's a pretty well-known book by F.E. Peters called Children of Abraham. It's not a perfect book by any means, but it's one of the first really earnest attempts, I think, to kind of talk about the three major religions that descended from the Abrahamic tradition. So Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And try to do so in a way that is not starting from one perspective. You know, there are lots of people who talk about Islam from the perspective of Christianity, or Judaism from the perspective of Christianity, or all those combinations. This is more of a comparative look, trying not to have that perspective. Whether he succeeded with that perspective or not is a whole other question. But this phrase is just kind of stuck in my mind when we kind of talk about the biggest division of them all in terms of the single God faith traditions. So that's what I wanted to use as a starting point. So one of the common threads between Christianity and Judaism and Islam is Abraham. We have a lovely stained glass window of Caucasian Abraham here. This is from the Peterhouse College Chapel in Cambridge. You may run into Ibrahim. That is also another word for Abraham, kind of the Arabic version of Abraham. Yeah, Abraham. Anybody know who that is? That's Zlatan Ibrahimovic. Vich is the kind of Slavic ending for son, so son of Abraham is his name. So you'll see Ibrahimovic, Ibrahim as a first name. Of course, Abraham is not a real popular first name these days in the U.S., but it's out there. And then we also have the anglicized Abramson and Abramsen, so the Norwegian version thereof, and then Abrams, so all descended from Abraham. So Abraham's place in Judaism and Christianity is probably pretty familiar. So we have the passage here. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and you and all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So that's from Genesis. In the original Hebrew language of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the name Abram, so it was first Abram and then became Abraham later in the chapter. The name Abram literally means exalted father. Abraham contains another kind of word portion, and so the whole Abraham translates into multitude. So Abraham translated literally means father of a multitude, and so you can see that here in that passage, how that's reflected. So Muslims view Abraham as a prophet and a messenger and a leader to all nations in the world. He was considered a leader of the righteous in his time by Muslims, and is said to have cleaned the world of idolatry at the time. The Quran puts a lot of emphasis on his personality, of him being kind and compassionate, and he's viewed as a model for how Muslims should act towards other people. In the Muslim faith, Abraham is also credited with establishing the Hajj, the pilgrimage. So we have here the Mosque of the Kaaba. So the Kaaba is the kind of black cube in the middle, and the mosque is around it. And so you may have seen those videos of pilgrims performing the Hajj and walking in a counterclockwise circle. So as part of the Hajj, which is that pilgrimage that every Muslim who has the means and is physically able is supposed to do in their lifetime. It's during a certain month of the year. And then you go to this place and walk around counterclockwise 7 times. If you're curious to see what it looks like inside, that's it. It's not completely off limits. First of all, it's off limits to non-Muslims. The whole city is. You can't get there, inside there, unless you're a Muslim. If you're a Muslim and you go during that month of the Hajj, you wouldn't be able to get inside. There's just too many people. There's no way they could open it. But if a Muslim goes there at off times, they may actually get a chance to go inside. There's often somebody there with a key who has the right to be able to open it, and my understanding is they'll show it to people who look like they're older or are not likely to come back, and they're invited inside. So anybody know who built the original structure according to Muslims, the original Kaaba? So in the Muslim tradition, the original one was built by Adam. And then it was destroyed. Any idea how it got destroyed? So think. Exactly, yes. So the Muslim tradition is it was destroyed by the flood. And then Abraham came to this place and rebuilt it. Since then, we know it's been damaged and pretty much destroyed many times, but always rebuilt. So that is, roughly from the time of Abraham, 2150 BCE. So I want to talk a minute about monotheism. So that just basically means worship one God. That's one of the things that Jews, Christians, and Muslims have in common. We worship one God. We can get into the triune piece, which complicates things a little bit, but essentially one God. And I think most Jews, Christians, and Muslims would agree that we worship the same God. Not everybody would go along with that, but I'd say most are in that category. I think we as Christians tend to draw a straight line from Abraham right to us. I think if you snuck into a room of Christians and asked, were Abraham, Moses, and David Christians, you'd probably get a lot of people saying yes. And then you stop and think about it. Christ wasn't born in the lifetime of any of those people. The Jews obviously can draw a much straighter line. In terms of Muslims, they like to draw a very straight line, but Muhammad was, when Islam was founded, he lived 2,500 years after Abraham. So there's an awful lot of time in between there. I want to point out, too, that Christianity isn't all that old compared to other world religions. I don't know how well that comes across here. This is a list of some of the major religions in the world and then a timeline across. The very middle is about the year 1. So, roughly when Jesus was born. And so it's kind of interesting to note that Christianity isn't all that old. The gray line that kind of starts fairly far on the left towards the bottom, that's ancient Greek and Roman religions. The Romans and the Greeks were not monotheistic, so they worship many gods. Just above that is Judaism. That's the one that starts even further left. This particular graph shows it starting with Moses. I'm not quite sure why they chose Moses, but certainly there was a tradition there for a very long time. And then above that light blue line, you see Christianity with the birth of Jesus. Up at the top, then you see many of the Eastern religions. So those were going full bore by the time Christianity became a thing. Let's see here. Any thoughts or questions so far? All right. So I want to go to look at a couple hundred years before Jesus. We have all these Eastern religions having existed. We have another monotheistic religion in Iran, Zoroaster. That religion still exists. It's been largely subsumed by Islam, but not completely. Christianity, of course, didn't exist, and Islam was a long way from existing. And this is the time of the Roman Republic. The Romans at the time tended to be, like I said, polytheistic. Religion was really very kind of tribal. If there was a small, isolated community for whatever reason, they tended to have their own version of religion, their own gods, their own traditions. They may have had influences from neighboring tribes or what have you, but there were really pretty great differences. And one of the things the Romans did when they acquired new land was they were pretty, at this time now, we're talking again Roman Republic, before 200 years before Christ, they tended to accept the local gods as long as the local gods didn't interfere with Rome's supremacy. And there are actually cases of the Romans conquering an area and then building a temple to the local gods, with inscriptions from Romans paying tribute to those local gods. And some of those local gods even got brought back to Rome. So there was a little bit of, who is your neighbor worshiping in Rome, and adopting new and interesting gods. So the philosophy of locally, not only tolerating local religions, but kind of incorporating it into the Roman way of looking at things kind of worked out pretty well for them. That was taking one of the potential points of friction and insurrection out of the equation. But it didn't work so well with monotheism. So when the Romans came to the areas around Jerusalem where the Jews were, that was a really tricky thing, because there wasn't a way to accommodate the one God philosophy with the many God philosophy of the Romans. But even before the Romans, the Greeks came. So after Alexander the Great, the Greeks kind of divided up, and the Ptolemies came first. And what they tried to do was give the Jews a lot of liberties for the most part. And that actually kind of worked. So there was a period of time where the Jews were very much under the rule of those Greeks, and it mostly kind of sort of worked. But then the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies, so two different kind of sections of Greeks, and they wanted to Hellenize the Jews, to make them Greek. So that was a really big point of friction, and that's where some of the Jewish revolts started up. So then after that came the Romans, and these revolutionary tendencies were always kind of there. So I want to talk a little bit of, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
It may have been, it probably was the case as well, that in the Greco-Roman world, it wasn't that, oh, you have this group over here that is committed to this God, and that group over there is committed. The same people at different times and for different purposes may have gone to different temples.
Right.
So if you're moving toward monotheism, that is a very different configuration, and it's going to have very different consequences.
Right. I should hand you a mic, because I'm not sure I can restate that very well. But do you mind if I do that?
When you're talking about Greco-Roman religions, it wasn't just that there were some people who followed this one and that God, and another group followed a different God. The same people may have at different times in their lives and for different purposes may have gone to different temples. It was polytheistic in that social sense as well. That changed considerably as you move into the monotheistic.
Thank you. Do you think that there were a lot of people who were like temporarily monotheistic of one God and then would switch to a different one, or was this just all part of the...
Well, it's all part of the mix, but as you said earlier, and I think this is exactly right, on the periphery, from Egypt, for example, with Isis, these gods sort of came into the empire from the periphery or even from the outside as lands were conquered, and they brought a different dimension to the traditional Greco-Roman religious landscape. And in some cases, while they may not be monotheistic in the sense that we think about it, they became more particularly identified and maybe moving in the direction of some exclusivism.
Right. I mean, I think, the Bible seems to indicate a lot of situations where a particular enemy was dominated by one god. Now, that doesn't mean that was their only god, but that was the one that they trusted in the most, that they...
Yeah, and you're probably going to go this direction anyway. It isn't that just one day the Jews appear on the scene or the Israelites appear on the scene and they're full-blown monotheists. They recognize that there were other gods, but the movement is toward more exclusivism.
Right.
And singularity.
Right. Good. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how the Jews divided. I wasn't going exactly in the direction you were talking about, but that was really useful. Now, you might think that the Jews would be pretty unified through this period because they had the temple as a focal point. That was still very much a thing. They usually had a very easily identifiable enemy. You know, that's always a good way to kind of get people singing from the same hymn sheet, if you will. But they did have a lot of sects during this time that were kind of building into the time of Jesus' birth. So these are some of the sects that you might run into in the Bible and other ways. Thing that gets a little bit confusing is we tend to look at things from the perspective of, is this religious or is this political? And the problem is that very rarely is it one or the other. I mean, even today, you know, we talk about Republicans and Democrats, but there's a lot of religion that's getting mixed into that. And when we go back to this time, it's even more extreme. It was almost impossible to be Jewish, religious, and apolitical, or political and not involving religion in some way. Let's see here. There we go. The Samaritans, we kind of know them from the story of the Good Samaritan, for example, and I think they're often portrayed as being complete foreigners. And I mean, geographically, I think there's a little bit of that. But Samaritans were Jews, you know, from before this period. They had the Torah, and they still kept on to that. And there are Samaritans to this day. There's not a lot of them, but Samaritans to this day have their own version of the Torah. And by the Torah, I mean the first 5 books of the Bible. The Samaritans, so they shared that common ancestry, but they kind of separated off around the time of when Solomon's kingdom was split. And by the time we get to, you know, the mentions in the Bible, there was an awful lot of animosity between Jews and Samaritans. So they were kind of considered foreign or other. But they really, I think in a lot of ways, should be considered part of the Jewish tradition. They just kind of went in a different direction. There are apparently communities in Israel, and I've heard even a very small number in Italy. And there's tends to be intermarrying between Samaritans and Jews, and so people kind of move back and forth a little bit. You know, I think they're quite a bit different than we tend to think of them in terms of how it's presented in the Bible stories. Then we have the Zealots. Of course, we have the word that comes from that being zealous about something, but they were an actual identifiable sect in the Bible. But they were generally Jewish nationalists who opposed the Roman rule. They had a guerrilla movement against the Romans at various times. There's actually a disciple who is called a zealot. Does anybody know who that is? I'm sorry?
Wasn't it either Judas or Peter? I can't remember.
Yes, it wasn't Peter, but it was the other Simon. So Peter is sometimes called Simon Peter, but then there was another Simon. He's sometimes called Simon the Canaanite. I believe I have that right. But he is also called in other works Simon the Zealot. So as far as we can tell, he probably was a member of that movement, at least nominally. Yes?
I don't want to digress, but...
Sure, I love digressing.
What happened to the 12 tribes? Did the Levites become the Pharisees? Is there any connection between the 12 tribes and these people?
Jim might be a better person to answer this, but from what I know, there are some parallels, but you can't put a lot of stock into that.
No, I think that's right, Paul. Yeah.
I think the Levites tended to become the priests of the temple, and so they tended to be in the sects that...
Well, and more closely in that case with the Sadducees.
With the Sadducees, exactly, yeah. But I would say, generally speaking, that brew of politics and religion crossed tribal lines. And so if you had zealots, they probably came from most of the tribes. That was more of a political philosophy.
Okay, there were two lists. There were the tribes, and then these. There were like a list of origins and a list of political or something, geopolitical.
Yeah.
Most of these would appear a little bit later.
Right.
I was going to say by the time of Christ.
Or the last couple centuries before the time of Christ. Yeah.
Well, and I think, there were certainly sects and divisions in the period more closely to when the tribes kind of, became a real thing in the Old Testament, but we just don't know about them. Not everything was recorded. I think, these that I'm listing here started in that real turbulent period where, they had independence for a brief moment and then they got conquered, and then they tried to have a revolution and then they got conquered again, and then somebody conquered the conquerors, and, there was quite a tumultuous period of time in the lead up to Jesus' birth, and then after that as well. And I think that lent itself very well to these political movements. And again, it was very difficult in that time and that place in the world to have a political movement that wasn't tied to religious beliefs. But I would say that, generally speaking, these sects would not tie very closely to tribes, with the exception of the Sadducees. Let me take a drink here. Other thoughts or questions while we're here? Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that there's Samaritans still around. Mm-hmm. But what about these other?
I would say that you can see traces in some of these groups, but for the most part they don't exist. I mean, I think I have this right, the Pharisees really kind of came to dominate Jewish philosophy and religious practices, and so, I think it's fair to say that modern Judaism owes more to the Pharisees than perhaps other groups.
Exactly right. What you said about the Samaritans earlier is is right on. You can go to Mount Ebal and you can see today the Samaritan sacrificial site, and as far as I know, they still at one time in the year offer sacrifices there. And so there is this Samaritan continuation.
The Samaritans were not centered on the temple in Jerusalem at all.
Right. They had their own sacrificial site. In the case, the year 70 of the Common Era is critical, because for all intents and purposes, when the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, the Sadducees, because of their connection with the priesthood and the temple clerical authorities, are basically out of business.
Right.
It is the Pharisees who transform themselves within the first 200 years after that into the rabbis and rabbinic Judaism. So they do persist. The Essenes, or the Zealots, were basically in 70 put out of business by Roman military force.
Right.
Scribes, they're functional. You need scribes when people are not fully literate for textual purposes. The Essenes may have left us the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
But they're out of business too because of the military destruction during the years 66 to ultimately 73.
Right. I mean, I think, you could also draw some parallels between the Zealots and certain modern groups of Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, and in your term, they were nationalists, and there are all kinds of forms of Jewish nationalism today, I think, too. Now, whether they function as the Zealots, there was a subgroup of them called the Sicarii, the dagger men, who were in the day, for lack of a better term, they were the ones who tried to pull out their daggers, kill somebody, melt away, and create chaos, much as terrorist bombers might, given the means that we have today, for example.
Right. Excellent. Any other thoughts before I continue here? All right. I think the publicans are interesting. I think I need to learn more about this, so I may go off the rails here a little bit, but I've always kind of been told publicans are tax collectors. Full stop, boom. What I've learned to understand a little bit is that maybe another way to think of publicans was more public contractors. So if the Romans needed a building built, they would contract with a publican, and the publican might even be part of almost a corporation of publicans who would find the resources and the manpower and everything to get that done. And where the taxes come in is that taxes were something else that a publican could bid on. So they could have the responsibility for collecting X amount of money in this particular region, and they would bid on what that contract is worth. And the reason that publicans became so hated is because the Romans didn't care how much they actually collected as long as they fulfilled their contract. So they would collect more and then pocket the difference. I'm going to throw it back to Jim just to see, is that your understanding as well of publicans?
Yeah. That's putting very modern vocabulary on it, but exactly. It may get at the heart of it. Sometimes the term that is used with regard to their tax collection form is tax farming. Right. You collect so much that you have to pass up the line to the occupiers. But you can keep, for your own purposes, anything you can extract in excess of that. And of course, that would be like turning IRS agents loose saying, okay, we want this much from you, but you can keep the rest or direct it to your own purposes like you describe, which is ripe for...
Well, and I think the other aspect that's interesting to me is then it probably wasn't a publican who was knocking on your door and asking you for shekels. They had people to do the dirty work. Yeah.
You have a system in place.
Exactly. So anyway, that was a whole new definition of publican. I think we oversimplify what it means when we just say tax collector. And that has some real implications too in terms of societal hierarchy. You know, these weren't people who were getting their hands dirty. They were moving money and making connections and, you know, getting people underneath them who they trusted to do more of the dirty work. And those people were getting people under them to do the really dirty work. So these were people that were pretty high in standing. They were working significantly with the Romans. That was just part of their job description. And there we go. And so they were very much in a different class of the average Jewish person, but they were Jews. They were definitely Jews.
Was John the Baptist?
I don't know. The question was whether John the Baptist was a publican.
Or Zealot, I said.
Oh, a Zealot, I'm sorry. I'm not aware of that.
More likely associated with the Essenes, simply because of the location, being in the wilderness. Now, we don't have direct evidence that that's true, but if you go there today, the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found is in the wilderness, not far from Jericho or wherever John the Baptist was.
Right. There was someone who you know in the Bible who was supposed to be a follower of Jesus, who was supposed to be a publican. Any guesses? So Matthew is said to be a publican. So who wrote the book of Matthew? Trick question. We have no idea. Kind of after the fact, it appears that somebody just kind of tacked on, this is the words of Matthew, but it almost certainly wasn't. But Matthew is where it says that Matthew was a publican, I believe.
Levi, he called. But
there's some confusion as to whether Levi was Matthew or not, too.
Right. But you're right that the gospel text didn't have these names associated in the first instance. They came later.
So then the scribes, Jim was saying, they were kind of the secretarial services. Many people could not read or write, so they performed an important function. So they, that describes a job, but it also, has political and religious implications as well. They tended to be very learned in the Torah because they were working with it all the time. Then the Sadducees were the ones who were closely associated with the temple, like we said before. They tended to be kind of an aristocratic, priestly class of Jews, and so when the temple went away, they kind of had very little things to do, and pretty much died out. The Pharisees, scholars of the law. Anybody know a Pharisee by name who was a follower of Jesus? That's what I was thinking of, yeah, Paul.
Yeah.
Paul was said to be a Pharisee, or at least instructed growing up in the Pharisee tradition. And then we talked a little bit about I can't remember how to pronounce it now. Essenes?
Essenes.
Yeah. And like you were saying, Jim, at a minimum, John the Baptist was well aware of them. I believe the Essenes had a tradition of baptism before John. And so he would have known of that tradition and may have adopted it from there. I mean, you can see how the Bible words it. Yeah, he lived and preached very near the city that was most known for having the Essenes. So any questions there? We're getting close to the end here. I think I'm just going to wrap it up there. I'm going to have just a couple more comments about Jews, a couple comments about Islam, and then we're going to go into Christianity. My main reason for kind of going into this direction was, I think it's just important to realize that divisions are not a new thing. They have been there the entire history of religion, and very, very significant. And I think we tend to kind of think about, the people of God in the Old Testament as this monolith that just marches forward into the New Testament. And yeah, then we started, gathering non-Jews into the fold, but it was this monotheistic thing, or this, very isolated thing that just kept on, insulated and marching forward. It's not at all how it was. So, thank you very much. Any other thoughts or questions before we go? All right, if not, hope to see you next week, and if you can't make it, these will be online. Thanks a lot.